Hi, everybody. It's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It is October 30th, 2024. We are in the Toronto Metropolitan University Library, room 860. So today we're going to continue with the 7 habits. All right, so very good. So this habit is seek first, understand, then be understood. So this chapter is essentially about the value of empathy and why it's important to make a habit of being empathetic and when we communicate with other people. And the way that I understood it, and in some ways still kind of understand it, is people have their own worldview or their own, he would say, paradigm. And when you understand what their paradigm is or their like language game, in a Wittgensteinian way to say it, then you can communicate to them in their own terms almost, right? Like within their own belief set or belief system. And then you can import things that you know or the things that you've learned. But if you can speak to them in their own language, it makes it easier for them to understand you even, right? And for you to understand, well, that's the whole point of understanding them. So the first slide, so what I do basically with these chapters is I go through one at a time. And then we read through the chapter 2. So we go a little meticulous, just kind of we did with the our Waking Life stuff. So I'm just going to read through some of these things. The first one is the heart has its reasons for which reason knows not of. It's a quote from Pascal. And so I think this actually says a lot about human motivation and about, in some ways, the things that will give us the most, in some ways you could say well-being, you know, and the source of even regrets. Because you might analytically, like I recently got a Nintendo Switch. Because I had a little bit of bullshit and I was like, I need to have something that's going to make me feel good, make me feel happy, right? And even Hume said that reason is the slave of the passions, you know? And you have to kind of figure out what the feeling is, like perception. Like I distinguish feeling from emotion. We feel our emotions, you know? Feeling is the thing that you use to grasp some interaction with your environment or reality. And so sometimes it's not fully formed into a thought, you know? And we might need to apply the structure of reason to what we feel. And then that way we can make sense of it and we can know it. You know what I mean? But there's this awareness, there's this initial exposure to myself, you know? And in that we could say, like, it could be reflective. I could be looking back. It could be mindful. I can be aware of myself in the moment. And then I could kind of project into the future of like what I would think I want and where I want to be. You know what I mean? So I think this is good. I think it's also important, you know, like on one end, you could say like love can lead us into great places, like the love for our kids. You know what I mean? Like that's a good thing, right? But then we can have like love in like unhealthy relationships that are abusive or whatever, you know? And I feel that like that's where like a principle like this could kind of break apart because you're like, I don't know if it applies, you know, to some situations. And so, you know, that's where it's important to understand the limitations of some feelings, you know, like feelings I've had for certain people in my life. Those feelings are never going to go away. It's not about forcing the feelings to change, but it's understanding that if you don't put a limitation, right, or remove yourself from the thing that is making you feel this way, like an unhealthy relationship, someone's an alcoholic, right, and they are drinking and you can't stop them from drinking and they can't stop themselves, and you might love them, you know? So it's important for us to have a sense of that. And that's where the feeling self really is something that's going on presently. I can remember what I felt in the past, but I think knowing what you're feeling, like it's more about now though. Now it's a memory, you know, but the feeler is present.
I think you touched on something there, which kind of the word boundary kind of popped up in my head, which is that when we're kids, we don't have any boundaries. So we identify with our parents. We identify with what the ideas and the beliefs, the emotions that are kind of projected onto us. And then as we get older, we tell ourselves stories as to why we are the way we are or why we are who we are. And then sometimes in adulthood, we can be drawn to relationships that were similar because they feel familiar and safe because they kept us alive. And so those boundaries, it's almost like they merge because we haven't properly established our identity separate from other people. And so I don't know what you guys think about that, if you think it's a valid way of looking at it.
Yeah, you can use that. That's useful. you know, to understand it.
This depends on society. For example, Latinos, the feelings is very strong. They love, they touch, they
Sure.
kiss you,
Culture.
they're smiling.
Yes.
So rich people in rich countries very serious, and these kind of feelings they perceive as something polite and something not rude. It's a sort of perception. So some society try to cut. How do you feel? How this overwhelm?
Right.
You have a limit. You should be serious.
Mhm.
And it's like kids, no, don't do it.
And you think that's what, if a person is trained or conditioned with that culture, it's harder for them to feel that empathy, for example. Right.
Yeah, I think initially that would be the case, and depending on the person's psychological state, like if they're capable of empathy, then it would just be putting the effort into like hearing the person out, you know. Okay, so next principle, and I may have missed a couple. We'll flush them out when we read through the chapter. If you want to interact effectively with somebody to influence them, you first need to understand them.
I do have something to say about that point, though.
Say it.
Yeah. So the reason I like this one, to interact effectively, to influence me, you have to understand me. And I like the analogy of thinking about the people closest to you, like our friends or our family.
Mhm.
And we can think that the level of closeness that we have with them allows us to be vulnerable with that person. And we're more likely to be able to influence them, and they're more likely to be able to influence us.
Mhm.
And so I think that goes to this point here. To influence me, you must first understand me. We have a level of understanding, like with your friends and with your close people, it's the highest level of understanding. And then strangers, it gets lower. And then same with influence. It's the lowest at this level. When you don't know them, they don't understand you, they don't know who you are. You're less likely to be influenced by them, as opposed to the people who know you the best and who understand you the best.
Mhm. I think it's important to what do we mean by understanding? When we say we understand a person,
Mhm.
what does that entail? Like what predictive value does that have? And one way we can conceptualize this is I know your motivations, or I know what your feelings are. You know, I like it would be to like look at the thing and then have some underlying comprehension of whatever's going on, right? So if they're behaving in some way, I know why they did it. Or if they make some weird face, I know what they're feeling,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
What does it mean to understand somebody?
Yeah.
But one thing is influence is give me information, let me think. Let me be free to think, because influence sometimes is somehow manipulation. I want to
Okay.
influence to buy this mobile, is my mobile. I want to influence to go to a party. So I try to go inside your head and try to bring to my
Mhm.
side. But I give you information,
Yeah.
and you are free to decide yourself.
Mhm.
It's different from of what do you think?
Yeah, so he talks about that. So I would like to separate influencing somebody from manipulating them. Influencing is persuading them. So I'm saying I have a $5 bill. I have too much stuff in my wallet.
Mhm.
How about I trade you this $5 bill because I can't fit it for a bottle or two of water?
Okay.
And you could say yes or no, right?
Mhm.
Whereas if I said, you know, the water's poisonous, you should give it to me.
Mm.
I'm manipulating you. I'm lying to you to get something, right?
So
And
manipulation has deception embedded in it.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's important. See, manipulate is a word where we use it to like arrange objects. Like the ape was manipulating the thing, and then a food pellet came out,
Mhm.
right? I think that when we take that same concept and we apply it to our interpersonal relationships, it's that I'm manipulating the person. I'm removing their subjectivity. And in Kantian terms, like David would like this, I'm using them as an end in them, or I'm using them as a means to an end, not an end in themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why it's bad.
Mm.
You know? So we don't want to do that. That's unethical. It's not good. Okay.
That's a good distinction. I like it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Our conversations become collective monologues, and we never really understand what's going on inside another human being. And so again, he's just talking about how some people have a habit of just being in their own world and not listening to others at all, really, or understanding them. So that's kind of what this chapter is about.
Mhm.
So he says one of the most important principles within motivational psychology is needs that are already satisfied don't motivate an individual. It's only the unsatisfied need that motivates. And Yeah, so I think we could unpack that a bit, but at a basic level, we can agree with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because some people can be confused, like they're delusional, and they're motivated to do some weird behavior, but is it satisfying a need? I'm not 100% sure.
I think there's also something within the statement here, which you can interpret as somebody's needs are always being satisfied in some way. And sales, I'll put this with a sales example, is that our job is to reveal problems and reveal needs and be able to link our solution with the problem. If you're doing sales, for example. And so oftentimes the need that is being satisfied, we can argue that it's being satisfied in a worse way than a different way that we could satisfy the same need. Like, for example, food choices. That's an easy example. I could satisfy my need for hunger by eating two different options. Option B is super unhealthy. It's going to satisfy me in the moment. And option A is the healthiest option, which may not be as tasty, but it's going to satisfy the need and maybe some other needs that are not immediately salient to me in the moment.
Yeah, like your momentary hunger and then your overall nutrition.
Yeah.
Or like preventing some weird
That's
physiological
right. So good
Right.
point. What kind of needs? If you have the Maslow pyramid,
Yes.
Yeah.
and you talk about physical needs,
Right.
but if you go to the top,
Right.
and in this case, it's different. This is my motivation.
Mhm.
It depends on someone and the needs. I mean, when
Yeah.
you talk needs, is Maslow. Is
Yeah, yeah.
internal? Is it physical?
Mm.
So,
I think it's just, I agree with you say for sure. That's definitely where he's coming from. Because he's referenced Maslow before. My only thing is that I don't know if needs and motivations are limited in that specific area. Like you could say maybe there's a need of anxiety, and that's why the schizophrenic person was maybe like yelling, and they were just reducing the need of being uncomfortable, and the way to get to that was through screaming at nobody, or whatever. So it could be unclear what the need is, and when we start getting into that, we get into this whole interpretive thing, and then basically it's just me. I don't know.
There's some like Buddhist undertones here too, which is that to satisfy a need, it could be momentary because we can never be fully satisfied. We're satisfied for a moment or maybe a couple of moments, but then we need to eat, right? We need human connection. We're always going to need something else. We can never be in a state where we need nothing. Even the Buddhists who meditate in the cave, eventually they're going to have to eat, drink some water, right?
Yeah.
no money, no. It's this.
Sure, like you can eliminate certain needs, but there are always going to be some needs that we have to satisfy, and that motivates them to move. Otherwise, they die.
Yeah. I think it also speaks to like when you meditate and you're in this state of like mindfulness or like when you really move into a different state, like conscious state, it's like you could just be like you could just be there forever,
Mhm.
and you kind of dissociate yourself from those needs of being human.
Yeah.
And and I think that just kind of shows like the limitations of certain philosophies.
Yeah.
And it comes back to just the human condition. And you can't philosophize yourself out of being human.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or some practice like meditating all the time that takes you out. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And that good, like David Hume talks about that in some ways, like that, like reality will kind of prove it to you. Like you could be skeptical all day,
That's great.
but then reality will take over and you're going to have to eat, whether it's not a reasoning thing.
I love that. Reality check. Cool.
But what about the reality? The reality is what you think or others think of the real reality. What is the kind or the real reality? I mean.
Yeah, I would say reality is that which exists independent of all humans. Like we might sometimes correctly kind of understand reality because we have words and but it's just like, does the word match? That's the easiest way to talk about truth or reality. And to a certain degree, we'll never really know how accurate it is. And we go back to Kant, where we can't know the thing in itself, the noumena. And that's why, like science, the reason it is successful is because it has this iterative process of testing and falsification and refinement of the words we use, or like I almost think of it like a microscope that's like zooming in, and do we have like it focused correctly? Are the terms focused on the thing itself? in such a way that we've picked out the phenomena so that it's reproducible, right? Like it's when you set the things up, it'll have that result all the time. That's what makes it scientific. Is you have a universalizable principle, and then you use it in specific applications or specific situations.
Right.
It's not biased to somebody, or you don't need to have like a psychological attribute of faith. None of that stuff matters.
But in order to know specifically what we're supposed to value, that's not a scientific answer that we can get to, right?
No. Well, but at the
That's why I
same
think
time,
philosophy exists, right?
yeah, for sure. And we need to know, and that's a good thing for philosophy because it shows us why philosophy is important.
Yeah.
But even people like Sam Harris would say that like there are moral highs and lows of there's psychological highs and lows of well-being. And we could argue that there is something to be said about the moral highs. You know, like not high in the sense on drugs, but like moral high is like
That's
you're a good person or whatever, you know?
Sure.
But for example, as engineer, as an empiric science, is I need the proofs. I need you have to prove me it's real, this formula. Okay. As a philosopher, it's thoughts. How can I prove my thoughts? I have no real evidence.
Yeah, you mentioned that before. Yeah.
With formulas, both empirical proofs, or it's different reality. How is my thoughts real? How can I prove?
Well, your thoughts are definitely real to you, right? I don't know them because they're like an attribute of you as a mind or you as a thinker. You know, like I can indirectly know them, like maybe if I look at an fMRI machine, you know, but even then that's not really what we mean by thought, you know. Then within the realm of thought, like there are some formulas you can use, you know, like you can look at certain ways of representing thoughts that have developed into statements.
Okay.
And then you can arrange those statements so that they're sound, right? That the structure of them is valid, meaning that the premises will always lead to a true conclusion. And so if one of your thoughts is a conclusion, that for it to be true would have to be based on these other thoughts that you have, right? And there are different categories of thoughts. You know, there's things that people say and like statements, like or testimony, and then there's things that you observe, and you can have thoughts based on that, right? Thought and perception are different, you know. So I think it depends on what we mean by thought. You know,
Are you saying that just the experience of a thought? So you're thinking and thinking about something. Are you asking, how can I prove that thought it exists from a third party perspective? That's why you're saying like it's subjectively real to me, but
Okay.
I don't know.
I give one example. God exists. It's real. God.
Right.
What do you think? Is my thought. It's real. It's reality. This is.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that.
yeah. So God exists, right? That's like an existence claim. And so Sartre said existence precedes essence. And so before we need to determine the existence of a phenomena first before we can discuss attributes of that thing. And so it's like the Bible is almost like a map, and you're kind of just going around to find the treasure with this map. And when you say that the treasure exists, God exists, then you kind of give the person the map to get there, right? But the map isn't really actually that good, and it doesn't actually lead you to a specific location, right? The Bible.
Or it could be mishandled potentially.
Maybe, but that
Like let's say, for example, we have any novel, Dostoevsky, we're talking before, Tolstoy. So we have this novel, and everybody reads it, and they're like, wow, all of these lessons. But there's no Pope of Tolstoy who's like, this is what it means, and this is what you're supposed to do. And I think that's typically what people have, the problems people have about like a specific religion, like a religion, an organizational structure, which is that, let's say, for example, the Bible existed, but there was no church, like no main church, no people, then people wouldn't have an issue with it, for instance. But the fact that you have a person or a set of institutions, organization structures telling you what to do and kind of imposing things from an authoritative standpoint and leading people to do certain things, manipulating, motivating, persuading, whatever, that's when things can start to disintegrate.
Yeah, for sure. When it's an institution,
Right.
but like when we look at so Kant again talked about analytic statements and synthetic statements. So analytic statements are true by virtue of the concept embedded in the statement.
Mhm.
So the subject and predicate kind of go together. So for example, if I say a triangle has 3 sides, that is analytically true. I don't need to go anywhere or do anything to know it's true. Whereas if I said that a circle, if I have the thought that a circle has a right angle on one of its sides, you'd be like, no, which is wrong, right? And you don't have to go anywhere to know it's wrong. It's just embedded in the subject of what it means to be a triangle, right? The predicate has a right angle or whatever on one of the sides doesn't apply to the subject,
Mhm.
and therefore it's false, right?
Uh-huh.
It just doesn't make sense. Then we have synthetic statements where we take a concept and that concept is known through experience. So for example, there is a book on the table, right? On the table is not something that is a virtue of bookness in the same way that like having, one continuous side, if you want to call it a side, on a circle is kind of part of it.
But it's not. It's a fact. It's not a thought.
Yeah.
It's a fact. I mean, I can see, I can touch. So
But you
it's-
can have that thought.
But if I am blind
Mhm.
and you told me there is a book on the table, I
Yeah.
trust you. Okay, perhaps. But if you, for example, say no, why?
Interesting.
So since
So what's the reality? It's the Plato mythos.
well, one sec. So analytic statements, it doesn't. There's no experience required
Mhm.
to know the truth of an analytic statement. The truth of the analytic statement is within the concept that is used in the statement,
Mm.
right? So you say, how do you know if my thoughts are true? Well, it depends on what kind of thought it is. If it's a synthetic statement, the only way to know is to go out and look and see if the book is really there. So the difference is whether one needs experience or not, right? Yeah. And so that's one way to know the truth of our thoughts, right? And so some things you may not be able to find them, like I was alluding to God.
How about the subjective experience, as far as like what I was talking about at the beginning before I think you hit record, like people having personal relationships. I mean, we can talk about activity in the brain or whatever, but there are people, thousands, probably millions of people who describe having experiences with the transcendent. You don't want, if you don't want to use the word God, you don't have to, right? But the
That's fine.
transcendent, right? But
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Those are things that you can't prove. I don't remember which category to put it in because
It would be in this context, it would be synthetic because it's something an experience that you've had.
right.
Unless you want to make an ontological argument that God, its existence is embedded within the concept. That's a different argument.
Interesting. Okay.
But in some ways, it has the fallacy of begging the question. Yes, Dodgy, what's up, buddy? You guys just got to talk because I'm in the slideshow, so I can't even really see. I can hear kind of.
Oh, okay.
Just-
Hey, how are you, man? I just quickly had a question about the statement God exists. Before I speak the statement, I mean, after I speak it, it's a statement. But before I speak it, is it a thought or is it a concept made up of a bunch of thoughts? Are thoughts themselves made up of things? What if you break it down, what is it before it is spoken, before it's just information conveyed to another person?
Yeah, well, speech, I wouldn't get caught up on the speech part because as long as as long as it matters the quality of the thought. If the thought is represented conceptually or in statements, then we can go down the road that I communicated, right? About like Kant's analytic or synthetic statements.
I mean, what is a thought in itself? Is it something made up of a bunch of things, or is thought itself like building blocks to build concepts that we turn into statements?
Yeah, I think thought is all of those things. I think it's like when you talk about Legos, you know what Legos are, right?
Yep.
Okay. So if you talk about Legos, you can have like a single piece,
Mhm.
then you can have like a built Lego set. And a built Lego set is like maybe like an essay. I think about my essay. I have a thought about the essay, or I have a specific sentence within the essay that was a thought. Whether it was written down as a sentence or if I just thought it as a statement, it doesn't really matter. It's because the content is relatively the same. It's just the medium of how the content is being distributed, whether it's like in the mind or if I'm saying it.
What do you think is the origin of thoughts? Dennis proposed something. I don't think he proposed in the chat when he was saying that maybe ideas are somehow embedded in the universe, the Platonic idea of things that are embedded in the universe. Like, where did they come from? How did we even start thinking?
I think that really what's going on is there's a consistency in this universe, and language just developed as a representation of that consistency.
And so what about the organism being a microcosm of its environment?
Yeah, fine. Doesn't matter. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It's just that like there's a limitation to like thought. Like you can't use it's like we're not telepathic in the science fiction sense, or we don't have telekinesis. Like I can't just like move shit with my mind.
What if our brains are like antennae, right? And I think somebody said that in The Waking Life, where things are just out there and our brains just pick up on.
Yeah. That's
like
fine.
That, right?
Yeah, that's cool. That goes in line with sense perception, right? That's kind of what it's for.
Right.
But sense perception is before thought. Like to think, you kind of have to have a mind. Like thinking or thoughts are different than just like feels and sensations. Like the dog and the cat, when I pet them, they feel good. Or there's this video I was watching of like some animal that's not domesticated, and it got close to a human, and the human like pet it, and it was first time experiencing like a person giving it affection, right? And it was like, that's amazing. Like it didn't, because it has tactile sensation, right? So it's almost like evolution got us to a certain point and it was just dormant, and then it just like this fireworks of like human cognition just kind of occurs. So I like that. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Cool. That's cool.
Okay, so let's continue.
Can I quickly say something before you continue? Just like a question. AI doesn't really speak out of understanding. It just compiles a bunch of information, and it just, arranges that information based on those. It really doesn't understand that you asked a question. It just predicts what it should respond by doing, right? Is that the human brain also? But rather than doing it from just a pile of information that it gets from the internet, instead it does it by a combination of cultural context and bodily emotions. So for example, when I'm speaking, I really don't know, just like 2-3 seconds before I say something, I don't know what I'm about to say, but it generally just lines up for me and gets me to a position in where I want when I'm communicating with you. Some people with mental illness, they don't have that ability. They're trying to communicate something, but as they communicate, they just veer off the topic. They start with one thing and they get to another thing, right? So it seems to me that we're not actually consciously in control. We're vaguely in control of what we communicate, but there is just like AI, there's a part of our brain that's just manufacturing this stuff, just like generating this stuff out of a bunch of information, such as like bodily chemical informations and cultural context and thinking constraints, stuff like that. What do you think about that? Are we kind of like a type of AI, but like a biological one?
Yeah, we are kind of, but like again, like I think it's more complicated for humans in the sense that like it's like the origin of ideas. People will say, "Oh, there's no new ideas." Well, where'd the first idea come from? It had to come from somewhere. That doesn't make sense, right? Like to say that there are no new ideas just means that everything is just reused in some ways. And there is this notion of like combining things and taking stuff away. Like Thomas Reid kind of talks about that, but as like our mental faculty, But fundamentally, I think that humans have this. You draw from culture and your pre-existing language in your there's this use element though. It's like I play with the Lego pieces, whereas AI is almost just like an average of all the data that's been input into the AI, right? Because it's like a linguistic model, and so it just kind of looks at all the language and says this is what it pumps out the average. This is what most likely some kind of standard deviation, what the meaning of the thing would be. But humans don't really do it that way. We do have heuristics, but there's also like that feeler thing, right? Like if I'm trying to understand what someone's saying, my empathy might be coming to me because I'm my mirror neurons are being engaged
yeah.
when I see the individual.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's not really an AI thing.
Like a gut instinct or something.
Yeah, and so there's different things that are going on with humans that give us this that what I would say amounts to when we're being creative or imagining stuff. You know, sorry. My sleep cycle is like reversed right now, so I'm like actually on night shift. So I woke up at 2 a.m.
Oh,
Yeah, it's okay.
I was gonna say you looked really tired when you came in.
That's fine. It's just I'm here. Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. It's just a training thing. You have to be able to do it under all states. Okay. So the key is the key to good judgment is understanding. By judging first, a person will never fully understand. So that's just, that's 100%, right? Like if you're being prejudicial is to prejudge, which is like making assumptions.
So
Okay. So slide 2. Never gets the problem of we're so caught up in our own autobiography. So again, that's the person just projecting their own way of seeing the world, their own paradigms, that we don't take off our glasses long enough to see the world from another point of view, which is essentially this paradigm shift thing that he talks about in the Inside Out chapter. Often when people are really given the chance to open up, they unravel their own problems and the solutions become clear to them in the process. So this is like a criticism of like men, where men are always trying to like fix stuff when women want to complain to them. And really they just might need to speak and just like a vent,
What about you talk about judgment and influence? What about prejudgment? For
Yeah.
example, you are from this society. At the first glance, I think you is in my mind, my structure, my society.
Yeah.
You are not reliable, or you have someone somehow let's solve my issues with you. How can I avoid this kind of prejudgment?
Yeah, well, again, it's you need to separate yourself from like independent of culture. We can develop prejudicial attitudes on our own. If there's a really negative experience with something, you can develop an association and generalize that thing, right? That's like what a phobia is. Or like the experiment of little Albert, when they had this like 6-month-old infant and they would like put a rat in the cage. Initially the kid didn't care, and then they just like banged a gong and the sound scared the shit out of the baby, right? And then they would pair it with when it was paired with that, the kid was scared of the rat, but then even like any fuzzy white thing would scare the kid. So like Santa Claus's beard, and eventually the baby like died. Yeah, it's one of those stories of ethics and psychology, right? So I think it's important to be mindful. That's the first step. But at the same time, there may be experiences that are just, it's almost like instinct. Not 100%, but you've learned something, right? And we have an instinct towards being, to listening to that learning, whatever that learning might be. But your learning is accurate, like with someone, you're dating people, like the alcoholic example, and you're like, this person just doesn't make me feel comfortable, and to not be wise to that would create more suffering for you, And so I think that I give people the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, when I see signals in things, I want to be mindful of that, And at the same time, I think that certain cultures may produce specific kinds of traits within that culture. You know what I mean? And the problem is that like being prejudiced or racist fundamentally just comes to generalizing everybody in a specific group, right? And treating them differently based on that membership, right? And they might not even be explicitly part of that member. It could just be like a pigment thing, and so, but you know what I mean? Like if it is a norm within that group to, for example, disrespect women or don't think that women should be educated, it would not necessarily be prejudicial to like it's hard to say. Like you could, like it depends on what you mean by prejudice. If you just mean emotional predisposition towards someone, right? Discrimination is the act of treating someone differently, and then then we can have our like the thoughts we think, like stereotypes, and then prejudice is usually tied to emotion. And so if it's an emotional thing, it's important to be mindful of those feelings, be aware of them first, and then apply some critical thinking to them so that you can separate out when it might be a valid like feeling about something, you know, or is it that it's just my brain categorizing shit, right? Because that's really the source of these things. It's how our brains categorize stuff. And the in-group and out-group bias, when we perceive people as an external group to us, then we can have problems of things like racism and discrimination and stuff like that,
But
right?
it's the same. If you're a politician, you are bombing with information. People from south of the U.S. are potential criminal, and this is statistically people. And I'm many times. Finally, I am manipulated. I think people from the south of U.S. are criminals.
Yeah. They have the same thing with like they do tests when like implicit association tests, where they'll have like a white person and a black person or person of color, and then the person will be like going to grab something, and it's like for police officers, like whether they like press the button to shoot or to not shoot. And statistically, like if it's the person of color, they press the shoot button more often. And part of that is how people are portrayed in the media, right? And and that builds up this association in a schema of different things in the world, right, relative to your culture. And then we start to build up these prejudicial attitudes towards groups and stuff like that. So being aware of it at first is important, but part of it is implicit. We're not even aware of these biases, right? And so, yeah. Did I answer your question?
I do have a question about definition, because you mentioned prejudice, and I always thought that prejudice was really localized in our thoughts, not so much our feelings or our instincts. Because, like the example you gave, if you meet somebody of the opposite sex, you're dating, whatever, and then you have this sense something is off, you're not really connecting, whatever, and if that feeling is there, then we can argue that it could be prejudice, but it may not be. It may be something else, some other word that maybe you can propose. Because I always thought prejudice was something that we're thinking about. So we're seeing a person and we're actively doing something with our minds to like project their own opinions and prejudgments on the person. And the emotional part or the intuitive part is something else. It's not necessarily prejudice.
Yeah, it's like the most recent psychology textbook I read on this, and professor, they defined stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotyping is the belief. Prejudice is the affect or the emotional feeling towards something. And then discrimination is either explicitly in like policy of a government or in the way that other people are treated with behavior.
Sounds like a dangerous definition, no offense to the author. Because if he's saying that prejudice is coming from emotions, then you're just targeting people because they're feeling a certain way. They have certain intuitions. And I have a feeling about something, and someone points the finger, oh, you're prejudiced. That's a very,
That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly, and that's why people like you're identifying the criticism against like wokeness.
Yeah.
Right. But I think it's important. Like it's not just like we're all prejudiced of each other. Like it's not like only white people are prejudiced of people of color. People of color are prejudiced of white people. We're all prejudiced of each other, right? And so it's what do we do with those feelings of being prejudiced? And how can we overcome them if, whether they was put there or not by us, and we all make mistakes. And so if there was a moment where someone was prejudiced, then you can reflect on it and then you can work with it. And they found that like the best way is to get people to cooperate in groups together so that you build relationships with people that maybe for you might be more prejudiced or inclined towards discriminating towards, right? So if someone has a predisposition towards being prejudiced towards somebody from India, right? And then to combat that, you would make Indian friends.
That is like number one. What is real? Your reality or my reality?
That is a different question.
What is real? No, it's a slide number. Reality.
Okay, what is real? Real is that which is independent of humans' belief.
So reality is not one reality.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, there's one reality. That was a statement, right? So there's no evidence to say that there's more than one reality. And so, but we won't want to assume there's more than one. We only really are working with the same reality, just like space. Space, we have an a priori intuition of space. that space is just one unit, and all things that are taking up space are in that same space, right? And so we don't know if there is more than one reality. But the information we're getting from reality kind of shows us there is only one, but we really can't know, right? Yeah, we can talk about that more, but that's a long discussion. Okay, so where are we here? The key is to genuinely seek the welfare of the individual, to listen with empathy, to let the person get to the problem and the solution at their own pace and time. Being influenceable is the key to influencing others. So he's talking about a reciprocal nature of influence. So it's not a power dynamic.
Mhm.
Okay, so the first slide or section of this chapter is empathic communication. I like saying the term empathetic because some people like identify as empaths, but lots of people have empathy as an attribute, right? And you can be more or less empathetic. Some people, like psychopaths, there's evidence to show that they lack empathy in an emotional sense, you know? But as in Orwell's 1984, the big brother had cognitive empathy because he knew how to torture the guy because he could understand his perspective and how bad it was. But the emotional empathy, there's evidence that they don't have emotional empathy. So it's like, if you're saying you're an empath, you're just saying you're not a psychopath.
Right.
Okay, whatever. Sure.
Mhm.
Okay, so he's giving this example of an optometrist, and guy comes in, he's like, my glasses aren't working. The optometrist says, okay, well, try these ones on. It's his own glasses. And they don't work, obviously, because they're not made for his eyes. And so everything is blurry. And so Stephen Covey says that we need to invest time in diagnosing what the problem is first. We need to deeply understand whatever the problem is, and then we can have some solution to whatever that problem might be, right? It doesn't really make sense to make solutions if you don't understand what the problem is.
Mhm.
And he said this is the key to effective interpersonal communication. So let's go to the chapter here. So basically the strategy is that I read the slide and then I just read from the chapter specifically, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so we have this quote by Pascal at the beginning here, and then he gives the example of, you know, you're in trouble with your eyes, you go see the optometrist. We're on page 274. You can open up that book. That's why I brought that one for you guys. Just because the glasses help the optometrist doesn't mean it's going to help his patient, and they just make the problem worse. And then he's like, what's wrong? They work great for me. Try harder. He's like, everything's a blur. What's the matter with you? Think positively. Well, he's like, I positively can't see anything. And then the optometrist is like, oh, you're ungrateful after all I've done for you. So just looking at how people can almost gaslight an individual that's not being empathetic, right? Did you want to use the book?
I couldn't find the page.
Oh, here, I can help you.
I don't think it was 274.
Oh, no, it's just, yeah, sorry. For this version, it's different.
But it's interesting, for example, one experience also, if I push a button, I have a electrical discharge, but I don't see you because you are far away.
Mhm.
And say, okay, do it. I can do it. I can feel. But if I see you, it's some kind of interaction.
Mm.
For example, today in Spain, 100 people dead in my city near. Because it's very touching because it's very near the people. But I tell you, okay, we are more dehumanized. This kind of news is normal for us.
Mhm.
100 people, 200 people. It's a reality. It's the Mediterranean area in Spain. But I tell you, it's normal for you. 100 people is nothing. But in my case, it's real. But you are not a psychopath. You are someone
Right.
who is normal in this time.
We're more
People
dissociated from your culture.
Dehumanized.
Interesting.
If I push this button and you insist, I don't mind. I tell you, I are your boss. Push. I can do it.
Mhm.
Don't worry. Don't mind. It's one experience. I don't know who was
That's an interesting case study to
scientific.
discuss.
Well, you're talking about, sorry, it's on conformity. Man, I am tired today. What's his name? Damn it. It's like a tip of the tongue phenomenon. I have to look it up.
It's typical.
1 sec. Let's just find it.
That's a good example. Like if something happened, for example, in Greece, in my hometown, I would feel more strongly about it than somebody else who's not from there. They would say, they might feel sad, they might feel empathetic, but they wouldn't feel it at the same level, even if they're not necessarily those
Yes,
people. Are
Milgram,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, Milgram's obedience experiments. So he has like the guy in the room and they're shocking them. And then the guy says he's going to die and they keep on shocking the dude until he dies. But he was just,
Guys.
yeah, he was just Confederate. He was like an actor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are you trying to say? You're trying to say that in your culture, in like Spanish culture, people are more likely to shock them or less likely to shock them? What are you trying to say?
I
It's
think
happened today.
no, I think what he's saying is like, depending on our association with a certain group of people,
Mhm.
we feel more strongly about it than, say, for example, other groups of different people.
That's in-group, out-group bias, right? So even sports teams.
No, because I know these people. I know I was in Valencia, it's in the south of Spain,
Ah,
and today I read the news. 100 people died because of one kind of, it's the weather catastrophe. Is raining. It was the flood, a disaster.
Okay.
When I read 100 people died in my city, it's touching.
Yeah.
But for example, for you,
right.
it's far away.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that has to do with just like it's more meaningful to you, right? And you can't like dissociate yourself because it is part of your personal
It's part of
like
the
life.
process.
It might be someone you know, right? There's a pain to your people from like your village, like wherever you're from, like your city.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like even like Iran, like I have an Iranian friend and she was sad to hear that Israel was bombing her country,
Mhm.
right? Even though she hates Islam and she's like, I'm happy I'm in Canada. She's, and if the regime was removed and her people were free, it would be good. But just the threat of danger. Yeah. And I think that like, there's this book called Against Empathy where he talks about the problems of empathy. And really he says that when we look at empathy from a policy standpoint, it's not a good tool because we can't be empathetic with 100 people. It doesn't really work like that. Empathy has like a spotlight attribute where you're empathizing with one individual. And sometimes that can like magnify the importance of one person's suffering over many people's suffering.
Mhm.
And then, you'll give a bunch of money. If you use these examples of like people donating money to like a kid that fell in a well,
Yep.
and that same amount of money could have been used to reduce the amount of like starvation or malnutrition or
yes.
whatever.
That's got to be a bias, man, because I heard about that, the studies they did in the early 80s or 90s when they were doing the ads for the African kids starving in Africa.
Mhm.
And at first it was like a group, but then they started spotlighting the one kid and they got more donations once they changed
Yeah.
their strategy.
Yeah.
That's got to be a bias of some kind.
Yeah, well, it's you almost call it an empathy bias in some ways. He calls it the spotlight effect.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, let's continue here. So, so he just makes fun of like this gaslighting of the person who is not being empathetic. And he says, you're not going to go back to that optometrist. We don't have much confidence in someone who doesn't diagnose before they prescribe. How often do we diagnose before we prescribe in communication? And then he gives an example of parenting again. The kid is upset about something, and then the mother pretends like she cares, quote unquote. The kid's upset with school, and then as soon as it is something that is not in line with the values of the parent tries to like force the child to just accept school instead of listening, right?
Mhm.
And then they talk about themselves, all the sacrifices you made for your education. And just telling the person to just be positive about it, and like it's just that we're just coercive, and not really like helping them motivate themselves. And then it says there's a tendency to rush in to fix things up with good advice. Often we fail to take the time to diagnose, really deeply understand the problem first. Summarize in one sentence the single most important principle in the field of interpersonal relations: seek first to understand, then be understood. Key to effective interpersonal communication. One thing I was thinking about today was, it's a side note, what is the difference between advice and wisdom? Or are they the same thing?
I think there's some advice that isn't wise, and there's some advice that is, in which case it would be wisdom, or some form of wisdom, maybe.
That's right. Don't give me one advice if I don't ask you.
Yeah.
People, they train superiority, intellectual, whatever. They try to advise you, do it. And says, when or why are you? I don't need your advice, for example.
Well, even if it's unsolicited, because there could be someone asks for advice, but then it's just crappy advice.
Yeah.
Like, for example, my girlfriend was texting somebody on the phone, and then the guy friend says, "Oh, you should just go punch that guy in the face." So yeah, you're right about that. That makes me feel better right now.
That's advice, but it's not wise.
Yeah, and he's like, "Thanks for that advice," right? I think wisdom would be determining what is good and bad advice, right? But also knowing how to take good advice.
And also how to use discernment for whatever advice you receive.
Okay, sure.
That would be from the taker side. Well, maybe wise advice would be advice that might be more universally applicable for the good. That
Yeah, you
could
could say
apply
that.
not to just that one person, but would apply in many different contexts.
Yeah,
It's
that's
more
I like that.
synergistic.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah. That's just like going back to the wisdom thing and like how can we see wisdom? Like empirically, like how can we point it out? You know, where's wisdom? We can see advice, like you could point and say that human is giving that human advice. You could like record it and be like, there's an example, you know? But is that wisdom? I think wisdom is a sense that this is correct, you know? And then I ought to apply it in my own case. You know, so I think there's wisdom on both sides. It's like, how do I give the correct advice? Can I see the landscape and then know where this person is? And then kind of show them a guidepost to where they want to be or where is best for them. But sometimes they don't even know what's going on. As a mental health worker, like, what does it mean to give somebody advice or counsel them? You know? Anyways, okay, we're leaving that. Just want to throw it out there. Okay, so next set of slides, character and communication. Effective communication, he talks about how much time we spend reading and writing. The key to influence is showing through your conduct as an example. And the example of us comes out of our character over time, which demonstrates the kind of person one truly is. Character is something that's constantly radiating, and we're always communicating through our character and our actions and decisions. And in the long run, one will instinctively develop trust or distrust for other people. Next slide. To know how to advise or counsel, the other will need to open up and you develop an understanding of their situation and feelings. For advice to influence another, one must understand their uniqueness. So again, to this point, like, it doesn't have to be super unique. I think your universal point is important too, right? But you just want to understand whatever situation they're in, you know? Building empathetic listening skills based on character inspires openness and trust. So that's good. And it builds this emotional bank account concept that he was talking about before. And he was saying earlier in the book, it was necessary to being empathetic and listening to the person is necessary to have this deposit in their emotional bank account. Which is another way of saying they're like how much they like you or how much their disposition towards the relationship. Okay, in this edition, the 30th anniversary, we're on page 275, character and communication. So he's like, now you're reading this book I've written. Reading and writing are both forms of communication. So are speaking and listening. These are the four basic types of communication. Think of all the hours you've been spending learning these skills. Communication is the most important skill in life. We spend years learning to read and write, how to speak, but how much time do we spend learning how to listen? What training or education have you had that enables you to listen so that you really deeply understand another human being from that individual's own frame of reference? I think that's important, from their frame of reference. It's important for you to see from your frame of reference, but without, and again, at the same time, there's like the self-report errors, like self-serving bias. Like, you might ask a person what they think about something, but it's not actually accurate to really what's going on with them, right? So there's this sense or assumption that we have this introspective infallibility, that when I think or reflect on myself, I can't be wrong.
Arrogant.
It's kind of arrogant. Let's not go too far, but yes, but let's not go too far just yet. Some instances, maybe.
If you feel ignorant, it's the door to the knowledge. It's the Socrates.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You're just trying to say, like, I know nothing, like that kind of.
I like
We
that.
know.
That's very interesting. Because we're also assuming that this identity that we've constructed through which we're filtering information is the one. I am right.
Right.
So if I'm in a depressed state and I'm thinking about a problem, I'm gonna appraise it differently than if I'm positive. And
Yeah, yeah,
empowered,
yeah.
Right.
That's the thing. And that's as someone that deals with people with mental health problems, or they're, you know, whatever you want to say it. But part of the problem is they don't see things correctly.
Yeah.
And their appraisal of themselves is actually wrong.
Mhm.
Right? It's like you're in a barrel
Yeah.
and it's dark and you're trying to, and it's like, what is it like? Like, what is the weather like? And you're like, I don't know, it's dark and
You're right.
it's shitty. Like it sucks. And you're like, okay, I guess. Right.
Right.
You know, in the barrel is Diogenes, it was Greeks
Mhm.
guy. Diogenes, it was a great Alexander.
Okay.
How can I help you, Alexander? You are the wisest in Greece.
Oh man, I remember that
And
story.
Diogenes,
Yeah.
he said, please, the sun is in between and me, go out.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
What
he
that
was
was,
story?
interesting about
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think he was like the naked guy.
Yes.
And then
Yeah,
he,
yes.
they're like, I'll give you whatever you want. He's like, I just like you want you to move out of the way.
Yeah. No, he said, yeah, tell me your secrets. What do you know? Or
Then you see.
whatever it was. And he's like,
Okay.
I would like you to just move because you're blocking my sun. To
Okay.
the emperor. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the chapter here. Where are we here? So at the bottom, 275. Few people have had any training in listening. Their training has been in the personality ethic of technique. So again, we can criticize. He actually brings up sales here in this chapter. So it's like, do you only care about the money, or do you care about this person that you're like? What does business mean to you when it comes to sales?
So in
Right?
sales, we have a principle, because I'm a sales trainer,
Mhm.
is that you keep their goals at the center of your attention. So
Okay.
it's like, it's not my goals. It's specifically what it is that you're trying to accomplish. What transformation do you want to achieve? And let's figure out to see if my solution will fit achieving your goals in the way that you want those goals to be achieved.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's great. So he says, if you want to interact effectively with me, to influence me, you need to first understand me. You can't do this with the technique alone. So he's just trying to say you have to be genuine. It has to be part of you. If I sense you're using some technique or some duplicity, like you're two-faced or some manipulation, I'll wonder why you're doing, what are your motives, and I may not feel safe to open up. The real key to your influence with me is your example, your actual conduct. Your example flows naturally out of your character or the kind of person you truly are, not what others say you are or what you may want me to think you are. It's evident in how I actually experience you. And so this goes back to his previous point when he says you can't talk yourself out of problems you behaved yourself into.
Nice.
Right? So if like some guy cheats on his wife and she like walks in it and he's like, no, baby, no, baby. It's like, there's nothing you can say that's going to take that experience. Like they're two different things, words and experience. Experience is robust in quality, right? Like I could say on the video, there are books right there. And then in your minds, you're like, okay, books. And you're going to think about what do you think what books are, but you can't visually see them. Like it's just, I could spend time looking at them, you know?
Mhm.
Experience is very rich in quality. And so when we do things like that, it's, you either that person, that relationship is basically destroyed. You just don't do that again, right?
Or you put that Shaggy song on. It wasn't me.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
She caught me banging on the sofa and he's like, wasn't me.
Yeah. Okay. So your character is constantly radiating, communicating. From it, in the long run, I come to instinctively trust or distrust you and your efforts with me. If you're hot and cold, your private performance not squaring with your public performance, it's very hard for me to open up to you. I may want or even need to receive your love and influence in the case of like family, but the kids may not feel safe to expose their opinions and experiences if they have tender feelings. So, and this is interesting because it applies to like all contexts, like right, parenting and being in business and like mature adult relationships. Unless I open up with you, unless you understand me and my unique situation and feelings, you won't know how to advise or counsel me. What you say is good and fine, but it doesn't quite pertain to me. So it's important to understand first, right? Exactly what's going on. And then you can tailor your, whatever you're saying. So it feels like it might, the generalized approach might actually be correct, but it just might not resonate with the person.
Mhm.
Right. And so have that general perspective. You're like, this is the principle, but then how I'm going to say it to them, you know, because it might not even be the words, it might just be like a pause. Or maybe you have to give them some affection or something like that.
Yeah, you know, vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the salesman vibe. That's why they get immediately put off by it.
Mm.
People associate salespeople with scumbags
Yeah.
or manipulators because sometimes they have that that sticky feeling when you're around them.
Well, there's scumbags that are in the profession and they ruin it for everybody.
They ruin it for everybody, man. I'm telling you.
Yeah. So what you may say you care and appreciate me. And I want to believe it, like the kids want to believe that. But how can you appreciate anyone when you don't understand them? We may have words from somebody, but we can't just trust only words. It has to be the experience. The words and experience have to be congruent. Someone may be angry or defensive. They could feel guilty and afraid. And that will prevent them from being influenced, even though they feel like whatever you could tell them would be good for them. And that's why having healthy, trusting relationships is important. And part of being a philosopher is being someone like that, right? Our duty to society, the Philosophy Society's duty to society is to teach ourselves to be that lighthouse or that role model for other people. And that means you have to be sound in yourself, right? You have to manage your life. Even though I'm tired today, I'm way less stressed than I was a month ago. Ask Natalia.
Nice.
Oh my God.
Nice.
Because I had to deal with some stuff. But yeah. And then once, on that side note, once you go through these experiences and you've went over the cusp of a challenging one, it's important to take time to just let yourself heal, to remove all stress and just feel your body and let yourself just like become relaxed again.
Yeah.
And you don't know how long it's going to take. You have to just feel your body. It's a feeling thing.
It is.
You know?
You feel your body, you mean the flesh or the brain?
Both together. And there's ways to do it, because you can get stuck in ruminative thoughts and you can just think negative things that are not true. And that's where the David Burns distorted thinking checklist is very important, to make sure that you're thinking clearly. But sometimes you may have something that comes to mind. Like if I say that something came to mind, it could be a thought, like in standard, like if you just think thought as language, it could be a thought or something else, right? Like some feeling came to mind and it made me think this. Right, that's kind of like how the processing goes, you know.
You know, most traditional medicine is based on medicines, and there is another not traditional medicines based on your feelings, because there's sometimes your feelings they can hurt your health.
Yeah,
But traditional doctor don't mind. It's sometimes
That's a good point, right? Because the person who's ruminating is also like through the activity of their own mind, they're actually affecting their nervous system, their body as well.
It's true.
That's interesting.
Okay, let us continue. Unless you're influenced by my uniqueness, I'm not going to be influenced by your advice. So again, I think it's just how the person feels. Like that's what he's trying to say there. You're not just talking to a wall, you're talking to a person. If you really want to be effective in the habit of interpersonal communication, you cannot do it with technique alone. You have to build the skills of empathetic listening on a base of character that inspires openness and trust. So again, one of the first principles of therapy is having a trusting relationship, right?
It's a key word. Let's ask you, what's the main skill for commercial people? Trust.
Oh, trust. Without that,
That's
nothing
all
works.
it is.
Nothing works, man.
Trust.
Nothing.
You have to build the emotional bank accounts that create commerce between the hearts. So next slide, 277. So this is going to be a few slides. Most people listen with the intent to reply by preparing to respond instead of listening to understand the other. Now, I've written, sometimes you can kind of take notes. You're thinking of stuff and what you're thinking is valuable. I don't think it's not functional to just dismiss those thoughts if you can't remember it, right? And I think that don't be absolutist in our conversations. Maybe we have to talk again. You know, we're human and we have to think about things and we're learning. And so we just agree. If we don't feel we got everything out, let's just talk about it a different day. I think it's hard with business deals because the deal is done kind of thing. The money's been exchanged. But in general, communicating stuff, you know, I think it's good to have in a healthy relationship. It's going to be able to have an openness to continuing the dialogue, right?
Yep.
It's cultural also, because in France they like the confrontation, conflict. I don't say discussion. Here in Canada they prefer to don't provoke any kind of conflict, or if you don't think, I don't think, shut up.
Yeah.
So I tell you, in some cultural, I go directly. This is the conflict. Put the conflict here, and this discussion
Right.
should be very hot.
And there's a resolution. There's some positive.
And you
outcome.
finally you have the resolution. You have don't keep inside
Right.
or in the drawer.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Or this is I go. How does Seneca said this was a poison?
Okay.
When you try this, you keep all of this inside you,
Right.
and don't throw out. It's a poison of your body.
Yeah, that dovetails nicely into what you were saying, because sometimes somebody might think the conversation is over, but you have more to say. And so you have to feel confident enough to maybe bring it up, bring something up again if you feel like it's not resolved, to make sure that it is.
Yeah, at the end of trial one, you could always say, there's some things that I'm thinking that are not clear to me yet. So when I better understand myself or what I'm feeling, I'll let you know and we can continue.
Mm.
You know, like that's a like a social way to merge that,
Social.
like a social move. You can just say that to the person, you know.
Mm.
Okay, so there's this problem. So most people listen with the intent to reply by preparing to respond instead of listening to understand each other. So again, sometimes you do have to let go of what you're thinking. You know, if you have if I can only hold like one thing, right, in my mind, there could be what I'm thinking or what the other person's thinking. So you're throwing me a ball, I have to like catch the ball, right? If I'm the one who's speaking, it's like I'm doing the throwing. And so if the other person's, so I have to let go of what I'm going to say so I can catch whatever you're throwing at me, right? Whatever the person's saying, you know? And that letting go, that's where people, when like they get the criticism, I always want to be right, you know, or you only care about being the last person who says the word or that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That's not being able to let go.
Mm.
And the person probably didn't feel heard, you know? Or people are talking past each other. It's like a straw man fallacy or a red herring fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
They're responding to a different argument, you know, not actually what that person's saying because they're not even listening to them.
Yeah.
You know? So the problem of projecting our own motives on other people's behavior. So projection is a thing, and that could be the case. You can always just clarify, like, do you feel this way or whatever's going on?
Mhm.
When a conflict with another exists, people assume that the other doesn't understand. Maybe it could also just be that they just don't care or they just value their own interests and that just doesn't, you know, like they just yeah. To understand another, you need to listen to them. Very good. We also need to observe them, you know. Listening, like what they say might not always be what's good for them, right? Like they could be confused.
Mm-hmm.
But it is good to listen. The doctor who's dealing with a patient that is suffering from cancer, you know, can hear the symptoms and stuff, but it's fundamentally like the tests that is going to inform the doctor about his understanding or her understanding of the patient, right? Or if the patient's comatose, or if they're like unconscious, you know, like, so listening and understanding are not limited to themselves. There's more involved in understanding. So he says there's 4 levels of listening. So he says you can ignore someone, you just don't even listen, or you pretend to listen. There's selective listening, so you pick out certain things and you focus on those. There's attentional listening, where you pay attention to specific things and you focus, or to everything, you focus on what's being said. And then empathetic listening, you intend to understand. You're not active or reflective in your listening, i.e. mimicking what the other person says. You're listening, you're not listening with the intent to reply, control, or manipulate.
But to understand, you should be in the shoes of the other people. How can you be? You don't know exactly your past, your issues, your problems. How can be in your shoes? Perhaps I am able to produce according to my filters, but I have no idea what is happening to you.
I can answer what I learned as I don't know if he talks about this, Covey talks about this, but as a salesperson, the best way to do that is questions. I mean, it sounds straightforward, but literally you're just asking a bunch of questions to determine what it is they're thinking, clarifying their points. Maybe they're confused and just want to ask some follow-up. Like, what did you mean by that?
Yeah.
No, just something to help them clarify their own thoughts. Because sometimes a person can think that they're clear, but to the listener, they're not clear. So the only way to be clear is to ask questions to find out.
Yeah, he talks about probing as a bad thing, and I kind of disagree with him. I think that being Socratic is a good thing.
You have to know, like, if I don't understand you, I can't, and I don't feel like I can empathize. The only way for me to get to that point is for me to ask questions.
Sure.
and carefully and empathetically, but ask questions nonetheless.
Ask questions. Yeah.
I think that he's like, when he talks about the probing as a bad thing, it might just be that like some people can ask questions when the person's in the middle of speaking,
Right.
and it's just let them finish kind of, and then you can do clarification questions after. Doesn't actually say that, but I'm just trying to make sense of it.
Yeah. And
Uh,
then the second point, you meant to write not listening with
Yeah.
intent. Okay.
Yeah.
No, the one example, well, now is the war in the Ukraine. Ukraine, according to Occident, is the good. Russia is the bad. But you have no idea what's happened to people in Russia, for example. Before history, the first capital, Kiev, in Russia. If I know what is inside your head, I can understand you.
Mm.
Before have one idea and you are the bad because you are from Russia, for example.
well, again, this is part of the problem with the whole listening thing, because like someone could just be fucking lying to you, right? And if you just work based off of their frame of reference and just take everything they say as true, then you could be manipulated. That's what Putin wants, right?
Mhm.
You can see that like when Ukrainians are not bombing their own hospitals. That's not happening. Like someone could try to make that argument somewhere, but it's just madness, right? And so just observing, that's what I'm saying, like this is in the context of communication. But even then, I still need to observe what you're doing, right? Like the judge in a criminal court will listen to the defendant, but when there's like a video, like Puff Daddy beating up some girl in a fucking hotel room, it's like, no, that guy's an asshole and he needs to be put in jail, and that's not even including all the other crap that he did, right? And so he could say whatever he wants, but it's like you're clearly being physically abusive to this person and they're trying to run away from you and you're pulling them down the hallway by their hair. Like, fuck yourself, you're a psychopath. You need to be who is not in control of themselves. I don't care if it's drug induced or not, And so listening, like we can listen and I can empathize, but I can still say you're wrong. Right at the end of the day, I understand your perspective. You're saying that you didn't, that NATO expanding its borders is a violation of security. Well, guess what, dude? NATO's expansion occurred because you invaded Ukraine.
Yes.
Right? You idiot, like Putin. You know what I mean? Like, fuck that guy, right? Like Ukraine wanted to go in, but then Sweden and
He's selling rockets near the border with
Mhm.
Russia in Ukraine. They don't respect the rules. So it's just,
But part of the thing is that you do not have the power to dictate how another country manages itself. You don't. And the only time that Russia actually came under physical threat was after it attacked Ukraine. There was never any bombing going on in Russia because of any NATO country. That didn't happen. When did it happen? Oh, when you invaded, Europe. That's when that occurred. Okay. I think I missed something there, but it doesn't matter. Okay, next slide. Empathetic listening. See from inside another's frame of reference. See the world as they do. Understand their paradigm and how they feel. This is just how to be empathetic. Gives accurate information instead of you projecting your own life onto them and seeing it through your own lens. Focus on receiving deep communication from the other person. Deep just says like they're really there are many layers to what's going on. Like, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And it goes through this like subjective, intentional kind of like justification. Making deposits in an emotional bank account. The other needs to perceive the deposit for it to count.
Can you talk? I don't think I missed that point.
Yeah, so he says this in an earlier chapter. It's like if you buy your partner like ice cream, right? And you're like, God, I love chocolate ice cream. I'm gonna buy her some chocolate ice cream. She's gonna love it. And then she's lactose intolerant. She's told that to you many times, and then she's angry and she throws the ice cream and leaves.
Okay.
Right? You didn't listen, and had the complete opposite effect.
Okay.
Right? Or she's like celiac, and you buy pizza. And you're like, look, you're hungry, and then she's like, I can't eat it. Right?
So he's talking about making deposits in the other person's emotional bank account.
Yeah.
By showing that you are listening, you're attentive, and you're meeting their needs in some way.
First, understand them.
Right.
Understand who this person is, and then I'll know what a real deposit is. So, for example, like if a person's like this friend of mine, she likes chocolate ice cream, right? Like we went out and she got some the other day. So now I know because I've observed her and I paid attention that that's something that she likes, I can do that, right? Or this morning, one of my friends was like late for work and I was up at the house and they're like, I don't have a lunch. I was like, well, you make your lunch and then I'll drive you because it takes like 5 minutes to get them to work, you know? And then boom. And that was a deposit.
Right.
Right. And then like, I'm so lucky that you're my friend or whatever. Like, you know, like you're there for me when I need you kind of thing. You know?
And I'm assuming also a deposit could also be kind word, like sincere kind words you say to somebody, like a sincere compliment, for example. They did something good, they didn't recognize it as good. For example, the person who's ruminating, or even just like an average person, they're like, oh, that was nothing. You're like, no, man, that was really important what you did because of XYZ. That would be a deposit in the emotional bank account, for example.
Yeah, just be mindful that you're not like being a hypocrite, that your actions and words are congruent, that they're in line with each other.
Yeah.
Right. Like in abusive relationships, you'll have one partner that's like physically abusive, and then they'll go through this cycle of abuse, and then later on they'll like have this like honeymoon phase again.
Yeah.
But then stress increases, and then the probability of conflict, and then abuse occurs.
Yeah.
So
Well, not with the intention of that, because assuming the person who's abusive could also do the buy ice cream thing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You just want it to be congruent. That's all.
Yeah. You gotcha. All
Yeah.
right. Cool. Whether it's
Uh,
words or actions.
yes.
Got it.
And to abuse, you need power.
Mhm.
This is for you, for a professional or in a family. This you have the power. I can abuse.
Well, what comes first, the power or the abuse?
Yes, because this is my I don't know the power is. I mean, I am superior.
It's the person's perception of who they are compared to the other person.
or the personal or is in a company.
Right.
And the boss. Or in a family, I am the father of traditional family.
Mhm.
And you are my daughter. So there's many degrees of power.
Many degrees of power. Right.
Yeah, I don't believe in absolute power. Again, like if you piss the tribe off, 5 of them are going to pick up a really big rock and just drop it on your head when you're sleeping.
Mm.
Right. So power, you know, like I believe like knowledge is power. That's one reason why my life is arranged this way it is. And yeah, but yeah, there is a relationship between power and abuse for sure, you know, and in like the therapy and counseling, they talk about this power and abuse cycle.
Nice.
And yeah, power and control. Yeah. So when we are empathetic, it gives the other person what he calls psychological air, which is like venting, or that's what we're looking for in therapy, to feel like we've been heard by somebody else. That's kind of like what I'm trying to do for you guys, you know, as the whatever you want to call me, and requires security because one opens themselves up to being influenced by the others. You have to be vulnerable. Security as in like self-esteem. You're secure with yourself. And so it's difficult to be empathetic because you have to have security. You have to have the capacity for vulnerability, right?
Mhm.
That's what he's saying. To have influence, you must be willing to be influenced.
I
Slide
do
4.
have a question about something you just said, which is actually it's maybe been there the whole time, but it just occurred to me
Yeah.
through this chapter, which is that there are some people, and I'm sure you know them, being in your line of work, who are I don't know how to describe them technically or categorically. Maybe some people call them narcissists or sociopaths, but they speak so that they can either manipulate or they just keep dumping. And so by being empathetic, they're being energy vampires. There's like all these terms. I don't know how to categorize them, but I think you know what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
Is that sometimes we're being empathetic, but the other person doesn't give a shit about your empathy. They just care about talking and dumping, and you're irrelevant. You're just a person who's listening, and they're the center of the attention. You know what I'm talking about, right?
It sounds narcissistic.
Right. So what's your, does he talk about that? I guess that was the question that I wanted to bring up. Does he talk about that?
I don't think he's not, like, from what I reviewed today, I don't think he goes into that, but
Talking about normal,
Um,
normal people.
Burns goes through that though.
Okay.
He talks about like the whiner and the Muri-Moner technique, where someone just keeps on whining, and then you can just like say, "Oh, it sounds like that was really, really bad," and it's just a way to kind of get them to stop venting on you. It's not a constructive conversation.
Got
it. We'd have to review that chapter. I forget which chapter it's in, but yeah, Burns goes through that and feeling good.
Okay.
It's very useful. I think you'd like feeling good.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
Okay, so sympathy is not empathy. Doesn't have to define sympathy here. He says sympathy is a form of agreement and judgment. So like saying, oh yeah, that's really bad. You know, I'm sympathizing with you. Oh, it sounds really bad, kind of thing.
Right.
You know? He says he breaks down communication as 10% are words and 60% body language. Or the sound 30%, yeah, we're missing something here. 30% what is being spoken. Yeah, it's okay. Sound, I don't know. I got to go back and check.
I was doing some research on this, and I guess that we're just talking about Covey here, but apparently there's you can't classify it numerically.
What?
The distribution of what's verbal communication, what's nonverbal. It's not
Yeah,
really possible.
it seems hard to do that, right? How would you measure it?
Right.
You know?
Mhm.
But whatever, we'll go through it for now. Listening for feeling, meaning, and behavior. So psychological survival need. We have a need to be understood, affirmed, validated, and appreciated. So in Maslow's hierarchy, he would say it's within there.
Yep.
So he gives an example of a Chicago seminar. There was a 6-month deal, and this guy, it was about to, the deal was about to fail. And then he's like, I'm going to try this empathizing thing out. Let me see if I really understand what your position is, what your concerns about my recommendations really are. When I feel you understand them, then we'll see whether my proposal has any relevance or not. And then the deal went through. And so he's saying that the relationship is more important than any technical elements of the deal. And that's really important. So we look at Uria and Fisher's book, Getting to Yes. It's the same thing. We want to look at long-term relationships and not short-term gains, like when it comes to business sales. Okay, so let's look at the book, 277, Empathetic Listening. Seek first to understand involves a very deep shift in paradigm. We typically seek first to be understood. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. They're either speaking or preparing to speak, filtering everything through their own paradigms, reading their own autobiography onto people's lives. Example, I know exactly how you feel. I went through the very same thing. Let me tell you about my experience. They're projecting their own selves on people's behavior. They're prescribing their own glasses to everybody else. If they have a problem with somebody, their attitude is that person just doesn't understand. So for example, this father had his kid and the kid wouldn't listen to him. And then Stephen Covey's like, you don't understand your son because he won't listen to you. And he's like, maybe I should repeat this to you. You don't understand your son because he won't listen to you. And the guy's like, that's what I said. He's like, I thought to understand the other person, you need to listen to them. And then the guy was confused for a second. He's like, oh, but I do understand him. I know what's going on. I went through the same thing. What I don't understand is why he won't listen to me. The man didn't have a vaguest idea what was really going on in his boy's head. He looked into his own head and thought he saw the world, including his boy. That's the case with many of us. We're filled with our own rightness, our own autobiography. We want to be understood. Our conversations become collective monologues. Never really understand what's going on inside of another human being. Yeah. And so that's kind of, we get to practice at least this a little bit at the philosophy study, like when we're here. You know? 278. When another person speaks, we're usually listening at one of 4 levels. We could be ignoring the other person. We're not really listening at all. We could practice pretending. We could practice selective listening, hearing only certain parts of the conversation. We can listening to the constant chattering. So for example, when you're listening to like preschool kids just talk, you're not really, you're selectively listening to them. If they say something important, you can focus on it. Otherwise, they're just kind of babbling. Then there's attentive listening. We're paying attention and focusing energy on the words that are being said. And then the 5th level is empathetic listening. He calls it empathic, but I prefer to say empathetic because it makes more sense. Because it's more of a skill, not just like an enduring trait that people have. They're not just like, I have blue eyes. You know, it's like it's variable. Not referring to the techniques of active listening or reflective listening, which can involve mimicking what the person says. That kind of listening is skill-based from the character and relationships, often insults those listed in such a way. They're also essentially autobiographical. You practice those techniques to not project your autobiography on the actual interaction, but your motive in listening is autobiographical. Listen with reflective skills, but you listen with the intent to reply, control, or manipulate. When I say empathetic listening, I'm listening with the intent to understand. So again, it's just comprehending what the person is trying to convey to you, right? Because this is under the context of communication, right? And again, with the philosophy study, like being philosophical, we may not understand what we're trying to say. That's why it's like a practice. You know, like I almost look at it, we all come together and we're like sanding this block.
Mhm.
You know,
Mm.
like in the Tao, they talk about the uncarved block of the mind.
Interesting.
And it, for me to understand myself better and my thoughts, it helps by communicating with other people. You know, and if I didn't say something correctly, or if it doesn't make sense, then you'd be like, Achilles, this doesn't make sense. Or even just when I say it, I'm like, that didn't make sense.
Mm.
And I need to repeat it. I need like reformulate the thought.
Gotcha.
But
Yeah.
what about your filters? I mean, your society, your knowledge, your academy, your university, your parents. Finally, you have your understanding. But I have also my understanding.
Hmm.
Even for in this world, could be totally not totally, a little bit different.
Like my biases are different than your biases.
Your experience, your life, your filters.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
You have this information and reading, but have perhaps another perception.
That's why we talk about it. That's why we're talking about it, right? And that's part of the richness of communicating, is that I get to, when I listen to you, I get to see your perspective with your filters, because you can explain it to me. And so if there's a benefit of some filter, like, you know, critical thinking or my knowledge of fallacies, you know, and I try to define them and show people when a fallacy exists, because then we learn from it, right?
Yeah. And I think the whole purpose of this chapter is to show people how to remove all the stuff that you're talking about within us, to really go into the other person
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
really get a sense of how they're
Shows.
experiencing the world.
Yeah. I just don't like how he didn't really incorporate being Socratic into this.
Yeah.
You know, it's unfortunate, but that's okay. We'll do it for her. Yeah. When I say empathetic listening, I mean listening with the intent to understand, seeking first to understand, to really understand. Empathetic from empathy, listening gets inside another person's frame of reference. Look out through it. You see the world the way they see the world. You understand their paradigm. You understand how they feel. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is a form of agreement, form of judgment. Sometimes a more appropriate emotional response. People often feed on sympathy. It makes them dependent. The essence of empathetic listening is not that you agree with someone, it's that you fully, deeply understand that person emotionally and intellectually. Empathetic listening involves much more than registering, reflecting, or even understanding the words that are said. Then he goes through this breakdown of the communication stuff. Empathetic listening, listen with your ears, your eyes, and your heart. Listen for feeling, for meaning, listen for behavior. So again, observe is better than listen, I think. And then you can use your right brain and your left, you can sense, intuit, and feel. 279. Empathetic listening is so powerful because it gives you accurate data to work with. Instead of projecting your own autobiography and assuming thoughts, feelings, motives, and interpretation, you're dealing with the reality inside another person's head and heart. Listening to understand. Focus on receiving the deep communication of another human being. Empathetic listening is the key to making deposits in the emotional bank account. Nothing you do is a deposit unless the other person perceives it as such. It can turn into a withdrawal when the person regards your efforts as manipulative, self-serving, intimidating, condescending, because you don't understand what really matters to them. Empathetic listening is, and in and of itself, a tremendous deposit in the emotional bank account. Deeply therapeutic and healing because it gives a person psychological air. If all the air were suddenly sucked out of the room, you wouldn't care about anything except getting air. Survival would be your only motivation. Now that you have it, air doesn't motivate you. The greatest insights in the field of human motivation, satisfied needs do not motivate. I guess the best way to say it, like, yes, this is a better way to say it. Satisfied needs do not motivate, because there could be other things that are motivational that are different than needs, but in the context of needs, if I just drink a bunch of water, I'm not going to be motivated to get water. Right.
You know, it's just I smile because one of my comments is see with your eyes and listen or hear with your ears.
Yeah.
You know, this is a very, it's Jesus said.
Okay.
Okay.
You posted that earlier, and then it fits perfectly with this thing. Yeah.
That's cool.
Exactly, yeah.
That's good. Well, he's Christian, so he's gonna.
He
That's
is.
fine.
Oh, really?
He's gonna high five you, man.
But at the same time, if I'm really thirsty and I know that I need water for the future, right? I can drink water right now, but then still be motivated to get water for later.
Yeah.
So this is 100%. Like, we need to massage this statement a bit for it to be 100% true. That's why I was giving that. Yeah. So okay. Only the unsatisfied need that motivates. Next, physical survival. The greatest need of a human being is psychological survival, to be understood, affirmed, validated, and appreciated. When you listen with empathy to another person, you give that person psychological air. After that vital need is met, you can focus on influencing or problem solving. So again, part of it is just being present with them and allowing them to express how they feel. And then you can switch to an analytic
Mhm.
mode of communicating, right?
He also talks about reflecting words, and he didn't expand on that, but I think it maybe is similar to what we were trying to pigeonhole into his thing, which is maybe ask questions. Oh, did you mean,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. What do you mean by this word?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
For sure. Yeah. We can try to make that work with that.
Okay.
If we don't have to add it just externally, maybe it will work within that
Right.
phrase.
Okay.
The need for psychological error impacts communication in every area of life. He taught this at a seminar in Chicago. One of the participants was bursting with news. Let me tell you what happened last night. I had a big commercial real estate deal, met with the people involved. 280. I looked if we were going to lose the deal. I was working on this deal for 6 months. All my eggs were in this one basket. So I said to myself, why not try it? Why not practice what I learned today and seek first to understand, then be understood? I just said to the man, let me see if I really understand what your position is and what your concerns about my recommendations are. When you feel I understand them, then we'll see whether my proposal has any relevance. I tried to put myself in his shoes. I tried to verbalize his needs and concerns, and he began to open up. The more I sensed and expressed the things he was worried about, the results he anticipated, the more he opened up. In the middle of our conversation, he stood up, walked over to the phone, dialed his wife, looked at me and said, "You've got a deal." I was dumbfounded. Then Covey comments, he had made a huge deposit in the emotional bank account by giving the man psychological error. When it comes right down to it, other things being relatively equal, the human dynamic is more important than the technical dimensions of the deal. Seeking first to understand, diagnosing before you prescribe is hard. It's much easier, some people might think, in the short run to give them those pair of glasses that maybe work for you but don't work for them. In the long run, it severely depletes both production and production capability. You can't achieve maximum interdependent production from an inaccurate understanding of where other people are coming from. When you can't have interpersonal production capability, high emotional bank accounts, if the people you relate with don't really feel understood. Empathetic listening is also risky. It takes a great deal of security to go deep into a deep listening experience because you open yourself up to be influenced.
That's great. I like that. I like that one.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
It takes emotional resources from you
Yeah.
to be patient and listen, and then you have to be thinking about what this person is saying,
Yes.
and then develop a comprehensive kind of understanding, right?
That's a great last line though that he gave. You have to put yourself in the whole person, and so you are open to being influenced. If I really experience life the way you experience it, then I leave myself vulnerable to being influenced, and that's scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure.
And what is relationship? I don't understand why they put all the eggs in the same basket.
This specific guy, he was working on this deal for 6 months, and I guess if it did, all of his income was tied to the success of the deal. So if it failed, his whole business would be
Okay.
not good.
Mhm.
Yeah, you become vulnerable. It's a paradox. In order to have influence, you have to be influenced. This means you really have to understand. And that goes back to why, so then he says right here, 281, that's why habits 1, 2, and 3 are so foundational. They give you the changeless inner core, the principle center, from which you can handle the more outward vulnerability with peace and strength. And that's 100%, because if you're not sound in yourself, then you can be volatile, and then that'll destroy that relationship, right?
Mhm.
All right, diagnose before you prescribe. So next set of slides. So his daughter was sick, and they called an on-call doctor. And at first, the doctor said, well, "I'll give you a prescription for this medication." And they're like, "Wait a minute, does he know that she's a newborn?" And they had to call him back. And he's like, "No." And he changed the prescription. And the sales example, first, you have to understand needs, concerns, and the situation of the customer. Understand how to relate to people's needs to the products and services you're offering. A lawyer will first gather facts and precedent to understand the situation before preparing a case. In product design, understand the consumer's buying habits and motivations first, before you make products and stuff. So 281. So it's risky and hard. Seek first to understand or diagnose before you prescribe, but it's a correct principle in many areas of life. It's a mark of a true professional, critical for the optometrist and physician. You wouldn't have any confidence in a doctor or their prescription unless you had confidence in their ability to diagnose what is actually the problem, right?
Mhm.
So, for example, his daughter Jenny was 2 months old. She was sick on Saturday. It was a football game. Super important game. The doctor was at the game, the guy that was on call, and he wasn't their personal physician. But that was the only guy they had to talk to. So they called him, and his wife dialed the stadium. They had to page the doctor because this is before cell phones existed. And then he rushed over to the phone, and then he described the situation, and then they made the prescription, and then they're like, oh, he's a newborn, so they called him back. They had to re-page him at the fucking sports event, and he came back again, and she's like, well, are you sure that he knows this? So they called, and he's like, oh, I didn't realize. It's so good that you called me back. I'll change the prescription. So if you don't have confidence in the diagnosis, you won't have confidence in the prescription. This principle is true in sales. An effective salesperson first seeks to understand the needs, the concerns, the situation of the customer. The amateur salesperson sells products. The professional sells solutions to needs and problems. It's a totally different approach. Professional learns how to diagnose, how to understand, learns how to relate people's needs to his products and services. Have the integrity to say, my product or service will not meet the need if it will not. Diagnosing before you prescribe is also fundamental to law. The lawyer gathers facts to understand the situation, understand the law and precedents before preparing a case. Good lawyer often will write the opposing attorney's case before he's written his own. Product design. You would never hear someone say, consumer research is garbage. Let's just design stuff the way we want to. Forgetting understanding the customer's buying habits and motives, and just designing stuff would not work. A good engineer will understand the forces, stresses at work before designing the bridge. A good teacher will assess class before teaching. Student will understand before they apply. Parent will understand before evaluating or judging. The key to good judgment is understanding. By judging first, a person will never fully understand. Seek first to understand is a correct principle evident in all areas of life. Generic common denominator principle, but it has the greatest power in the area of interpersonal relations. Okay, next slide. So 4 autobiographical responses. Number 1, evaluate. We can agree or disagree when someone's talking. Number 2, we can probe. We can ask questions from our own frame of reference, which again could be us projecting, controlling, and evading. Language of logic is different than the language of feeling and sentiment. And then number 3, counsel based on our experiences. So maybe in this kind of probing, it's like there's like assumptions in the questions, like it's a leading question instead of being an open-ended question or Socratic. Next slide, number 4, we can interpret, figure things out, explain the motives, behaviors based on our own interpretations. Example 1, role-playing, empathetic listening. So he does this role-playing in his seminars, and people can understand their own typical responses in role-playing, and they can see how they have this pattern of responding. Number 2, the father is upset with his son because he wants to become a mechanic. The father does not attempt to understand his son's thoughts and feelings. By seeking to understand, the father turns a transactional opportunity into a transformational opportunity, creates a situation with transforming impact. If the son's response is logical, the father can ask questions, counsel, influence, and transform. If the son's response is emotional, the father must switch to empathetic listening until the son is open and logical again. So that's that switching part, right? Mm-hmm. Understanding is limited if it's based on words alone. Next slide. 4 developmental stages of empathetic listening. Number 1, you can mimic content, active or reflective listening. Listen to the words and repeat them. There's no evaluation, probing, or interpreting. Displays that you're at least paying attention. Number 2, rephrase content. Limited to verbal communication. Rephrase meaning in your own words. Reflect feeling. Attention to how the person feels in contrast to what's being said. Rephrase content and reflect feeling. Authentically seek to understand. Give psychological air and help the other work through their thoughts and feelings. And slide 4, see the problem from the same perspective as the other instead of being oppositional. Transformation can come from within if people are if they're allowed to talk about how they're thinking or feeling. Empathetic listening skills are effective only when from a sincere desire to understand. People resent manipulation. Empathetic listening take more initial investment but saves time in the future. Less time than backing up and correcting misunderstandings. Example 3, he was writing Hawaii. And this is not really a good example because you're not really being empathetic with yourself. You're something else. So he was writing stuff. He had all these papers on his desk, and then the window was open and the breeze came and blew all those papers everywhere. And he started to panic because of the sense of a loss of order. And then he realized he just needed to take a moment to close the window. So discerning empathetic listener, read situations. So he's more talking about just being mindful. And this is more of a mindful example and not being reactive, but whatever. Read situations in depth, quickly, show acceptance, understand, so others feel safe to open layers to the core of the problem. Okay, so let's go to the text here. 282. We listen autobiographically, tend to respond in one of four ways. We evaluate, we either agree or disagree. We probe, we ask questions from our own frame of reference. We advise, we give counsel based on our own experience. We interpret, we try to figure people out, to explain their motives, their behavior based on our own motives and behavior. These responses come naturally to us. We're deeply scripted in them. We live around models of them all the time. How do they affect our ability to really understand? If I'm trying to communicate with my son, he can feel free to open himself up to me when I evaluate everything he says before he really explains it. Am I giving him psychological air? How does he feel when I ask questions? Probing is playing 20 questions. It's autobiographical, not necessarily because it could be Socratic. So in this, I'm a little like, meh. You can be controlling and invading in how you ask questions, but not necessarily. I'm going to interpret this as I read it. Logical, and the language of logic is different than the language of emotion. You can ask questions all day, but not know what's important to somebody. Constantly, so I think it's the right questions and how the questions are being asked. Probing is one of the main reasons parents do not get close to their kids. For example, how are things going? Fine. What's happening? Nothing. What's going on at school? Nothing. What are your plans for the weekend? I don't know. You can't get them off the phone. You get 1 and 2 word answers. The house is a motel where they eat and sleep, but they never share and they're not open or transparent. If every time they do open up, you elephant stomp them with autobiographical advice and I told you so's, are they likely to continue? We're so deeply scripted in these responses that we don't even realize when we use them. Shock them deeply as we role play empathetic listening situations, and they finally begin to listen to their own typical responses. When he's teaching this concept at seminars across the country. They begin to see how they normally respond and learn to listen with empathy. They can see the dramatic results in communication. Seek first to understand becomes the most exciting, most immediately applicable of all the 7 habits. And a typical communication, 284 in this book, between father and his son, again, the father's words in terms of 4 different responses. So this is just like him going through it and he's like reinterpreting it, right? So it's the same dialogue. It's like, what's the matter? School sucks, it's impractical. Well, you can't see the benefits. Thinking of what a waste of time some of the classes were. Classes turned out to be the most helpful to me later on. And he says, he's advising him. But he's going to take 10 years of my life. But his friend's an auto mechanic. And he's like, well, he evaluates being an auto mechanic. It's not very good. But his son's like, but making money is practical. And he's like, it looks like that now, but in the future, education is the only thing that's going to prepare you for life, which is advising again. So he goes through this evaluating, advising, approach. And Covey obviously wrote this way. So I don't, but whatever. So the father was well-intended at the bottom of 284. He wanted to help, but did he actually understand? If you look more carefully, not just his words, thoughts, and feelings, look at the possible effect of the responses. And so in this rendition of it, it's like he's projecting what the kid would think. So the kid's like, school sucks. He's really trying to say, I want to talk with you. I need your attention. And then dad's like, what's wrong? So he's like, you're interested. What's going on? I don't get anything out of school. What he's really saying is I have a problem with school and I feel terrible about it. Well, you can't see the benefits yet. Oh no. So this is what the kid's saying. Dad's telling me his autobiography again. That's not what I want to talk about. I don't care about, how dad had to walk uphill both ways to get to school. It doesn't matter to me. That's his problem. It's not going to solve my problem. And then he talks about the auto mechanic thing. And then the kid's interpretation of this was, Dad wouldn't like me if I was a mechanic. He wouldn't like me if I finished school. I have to justify what I was trying to tell him. And then the dad's like talking about how if you don't go to school, you wish that you stayed in school. And then the kid's interpretation is, this is another lecture on the value of education. And then the dad says, you don't want to be a mechanic. And then the kid says, well, how do you know what I want? Right. Then he talks about his friend Joe. He's doing really well in life. And then the kid's thinking, well, he's not a failure. He didn't finish school and he's doing well. And then the father says, well, are you really trying in school? And then the kid is thinking, I need to talk to you about something important, but you're not even listening to me. You're just saying whatever the hell you want to say. And then the kid, and he talks about, you're in a really good school. And he's like, well, okay, now the subject is on credibility, but I don't want to talk about that. There's something I need to talk about to you. And then he starts talking about how he thinks he's a moron. And then he talks about the guilt trip. And then finally, you just don't understand. You're not focused on the problem. I can never tell you. It was stupid to try to talk to you in the first place. And so he's just trying to say that, like, basically, you need to be empathetic and listen to people, right? Because you're imposing your own views on things that are not actually accurate. So can you see how limited we are when we try to understand another person on the basis of words alone? Especially when we're looking at that person through our own glasses or our own perspective. Can you see how limiting our autobiographical responses are to the person who is genuinely trying to get us to understand them? You'll never be able to truly step inside another person to see the world as they see it until you develop the desire to, strength of personal character, and the positive emotional bank account, as well as the empathetic listening skills to do it. The skill is the tip of the iceberg that involves 4 developmental stages. First is the least effective, to mimic content. The skill taught in active or reflective listening. Without the character and relationship base, it's often insulting to people and causes them to close up. The first stage skill, because it's at least causes you to listen to what's being said. Mimicking content is easy. You listen to the words coming out of someone's mouth and you repeat them. Essentially, you repeated back the content of what was being said. Haven't evaluated or probed or advised or interpreted. You show you're paying attention to their words, but to understand, you have to do more. The second stage of empathetic listening, again, this is according to Covey, is to rephrase the content. It's a little more effective, but still say it in your own words. Still limited to verbal communication. So you put the meaning in your own words. 287, you're thinking about what they said with the logical side of your brain. The third stage brings your right side of the brain into operation, which is more the limbic system though. You reflect feeling, not paying much attention to what he's saying as you are to the way they feel about what they're saying. The fourth stage includes both the second and the third. You rephrase the content and reflect feeling. Frustration is the feeling. School is the content. Using both sides of your brain to understand both sides of their communication. Use 4-stage empathetic listening skills is really incredible. Authentically seek to understand. You rephrase the content and reflect feeling. You give them psychological air. You help them work through their own thoughts and feelings. As they grow in confidence of your sincere desire to really listen and understand, the barrier between what's going on inside them and what's actually being communicated disappears. It allows mind-to-mind flow. They're not thinking and feeling one thing and communicating another. They trust and their feelings come through. So the last example, he says, I think this is the last example. Yeah. So he says, school sucks. I want to talk with you. I want to get your attention. He's like, you sound frustrated about school. And then the kid's like, yeah, that is how I feel. He's like, it's impractical. I'm not getting out of it. You feel like school's not doing you any good. Let me think. Yeah, that is what I mean. And then he talks about Joe and some other stuff. And then, yeah, so it worked out that he got really bad on his reading test. And the test said he was at a 4th grade level, but he's in like grade 10. And so that was the real problem. But in the previous example, that never came out. What a difference real understanding can make. All the well-meaning advice in the world won't amount to anything if we're not addressing the real problem. We'll never get to the problem if we're so caught up in our own way of thinking, our own paradigms, and we don't take off the glasses we see the world so we can see a different point of view. By seeking first to understand, the Father has turned a transactional opportunity into a transformational opportunity. Instead of interacting on the surface, get the job done level of communication, he has created a situation in which now he can have a transforming impact, not only on his son, but also on the relationship. By setting aside his own autobiography and really seeking to understand, he's made a tremendous deposit in the emotional bank account and has empowered his son to open layer upon layer and to get to the real issue. Father and son are on the same side of the table looking at the problem, instead of on opposite sides across from the table looking at each other. Son is opening up and asking for advice. As the father begins to counsel, He needs to be sensitive to his son's communication. 289. As long as the response is logical, the father can effectively ask questions and give counsel. The moment the response becomes emotional, he needs to go back into empathetic listening. I can see some things you might want to consider. Like what? The kid says. And the father says, well, you could get some special help with your reading, like a tutoring program. And then they just go through it, and he just repeats the same procedure. And then, and then the kid's like, if I thought the tutoring course would really help, I'd be down there every day. And he just lets the kid sort through the problem on his own by just letting him talk and not solving the problem for him. The son is once more open and logical, opening his father's autobiography. Again, he's asking his father for advice instead of his father giving it to him unsolicitedly. And the father has another opportunity to influence and transform. Times when transformation requires no outside counsel, often when people are really given the chance to open up, they unravel their own problems and the solutions become clearer to them in the process. At other times, they really need additional perspective and help. The key is to genuinely seek the welfare of the individual, to listen with empathy, to let the person get to the problem and to the solution at their own pace and time. Layer upon layer, it's like peeling an onion until you get to the soft inner core. When people are really hurting, you really listen with a pure desire to understand, and you'll be amazed how fast they'll open up. They want to open up. Children, for example, want to communicate to their parents more than their peers, in Covey's terms. They will if they feel that their parents love them unconditionally and will be faithful to them after they tell them stuff and not judge or ridicule them. You really seek to understand without hypocrisy and without guile. There will be times when you will be literally stunned with your pure knowledge and understanding that will flow to you from another human being. 290. Even always necessary to talk, it isn't even always necessary to talk in order to empathize. Sometimes words may just get in the way. The technique alone will not work. This kind of understanding transcends technique. The skills of empathetic listening, because the skill is an important part of any habit. We need to have the skills. The skills will not be effective unless they come from a sincere desire to understand. Excuse me. People will resent any attempt to manipulate them. If you're dealing with people you're close to, it's helpful to tell them what you're doing. I read this book about listening and empathy. I realize I haven't listened to you. I want to. It's hard for me. I'm going to work at it. I really care about you and I want to understand. I hope you'll help me. Affirming your motive is a huge deposit. If you're not sincere, I wouldn't even try it. It may create openness and a vulnerability that will later turn that will later turn to your harm when a person discovers that you really didn't care. Is that even written clearly? So their vulnerability and openness will become harmful to them if they discover you didn't care about them. Really didn't want them to listen. It will leave them exposed and hurt. The technique has to come from a massive base of character. There are people who will protest that empathetic listening takes too much time. It may take a little more time initially, but it saves much time downstream. The most efficient thing you can do if you're a doctor is to prescribe a wise treatment, is to make an accurate diagnosis. You can't say, I don't have time to diagnose, just take this. He remembers writing when he was in Hawaii one time. There was a soft breeze blowing. He opened two windows. The breeze got really intense, and all his stuff started blowing all over the place, all his paper. He became frantic because things weren't in order. He realized it would be better to take 10 seconds to close one of the windows. Again, that's more being mindful, not really empathy right there, but whatever. Empathetic listening takes time. It doesn't take anywhere near as much time as it takes to back up and correct misunderstandings, to live with unexpressed and unsolved problems, to deal with the results of not giving people psychological air. A discerning, empathetic listener can read what's happening down deep fast and can show such acceptance, such understanding that the other people will feel safe to open up layer after layer until they get to the soft inner core where the problem really lies. And when he says soft inner core, it's because you're upset about it usually.
Yeah.
Like they're emotional.
Yeah.
And so if they feel threatened, they won't be able to allow you into that emotional vulnerability. People want to be understood. Whatever investment of time it takes to do that will bring much greater returns of time as you work from an accurate understanding of the problems and issues from a high emotional bank account. The results when a person feels deeply understood. Okay, so we got to the end of 291 in this book. And so next week, we're going to start from understanding perception, and we're basically just going to finish it. So it's like 15 pages to finish out this one. And then we're going to go back to, we'll go to synergize next. Okay, so we're almost done this book. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I found it very interesting how we can try to understand from his perspective what he meant by framing his experience in Hawaii as empathy. That's
Okay.
interesting. And so I think maybe what he's trying to say is that he was not judging his experience of whatever occurred. And maybe that's mindfulness. Maybe this book came before mindfulness came into the picture culturally. I don't know. But maybe he was trying to add like an emotional layer to his experience where he was maybe like kind with himself, or instead of like, papers go everywhere. Sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but I can get pissed if something happens, you know what I mean?
Obviously, yeah.
So, maybe he's empathizing with himself in that sense.
I mean, that's just mindfulness.
He's pretending as if he's somebody else. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. No, yeah. I get it.
It's interesting because also engineer in my mind, language of logic. All should be logic. It's a logical meaning. And you have language of feelings.
Mhm.
It's on the other side.
Yeah.
So you have, as a commercial, you need emotional links.
Mhm.
This is a paralingual. This is non-verbal language. There's many things. I have my idea and how can I express to understand with my feelings or with my psychological logic.
Well, people will use words to express themselves, and it may not, like, through talking we can make sense of it. So it might not be logical initially, but that's why you just let them express themselves, and then you can apply the logic and reasoning like after.
Yeah. Because feeling comes first for a lot of people. Like, say, for example, you're opening up to me and I become logical. You're feeling before you're thinking. So I'm being logical, and you're like, and you feel something, and the feeling that you have, you then verbalize as he's not listening. So you are interpreting my reactions, but through that feeling. I think that's what he's saying. So it's like, don't use logic right away, because that's going to trigger a feeling in somebody. That's going to put up some walls.
Yeah, and that'll prevent you from
Yeah.
them, because what you need them to do is express that other emotional vulnerability.
Oh.
And so if they get triggered and they don't feel comfortable, like the trust and the safety goes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have to add a layer of logic to explain how you didn't like mean it that way. And sometimes that happens. It
Yeah.
happened to me today. I was having a conversation with a very close person of mine, and I tried to, they misinterpreted what I said, and I had to really explain it very calmly. And then it was cool, but I did have to go through a logical phase so we can get back to that space.
Well, it's good that you were able to navigate that.
Yeah.
That happens though sometimes.
It
Right.
happens, man.
Okay, that was good for today, and I'll see you guys next week. We're gonna finish this habit, and then I think I'd like to chop through some of this book. So next week we'll do that, and then the week after we'll maybe jump into Synergize right away. And then the next movie is Gattaca.
Oh,
Oh, wow. I haven't seen that in a while. That's good.
Yeah. So we'll find a good time to go through Gattaca. So we'll watch it, and then we will talk about it. Cool. So we do it whenever. I'm not getting just because the previous movie took us a month.
Yeah. We're almost done the book, man.
Yeah, almost done the book. Like really at the end. Okay, so I'll see you guys next week.